welcome to the first episode of the Router podcast hosted by UQCS. Today I have Ryan Kurz joining us to talk a bit about finding and getting the job that you want. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Ryan.
Hey, yeah. So if you don't know me, I'm in my fifth year of software engineering, and over the last 2.5 to 3 years, I've worked at about 6 different companies. As I get closer to graduation, sort of trying to find out what I want to do. So those companies are everywhere, I think, but some of them include SAP and Google and the Queensland government. And I'm currently working as a software engineer part-time until I graduate this year. So have pretty strong opinions about getting the job you want and how to get there. So yeah, hopefully I can help share some insight into that.
That's very, very cool. What do you think? So I feel like you've had quite a few more positions than a lot of people in your position or at your time period in their degree. What do you feel like really helped you get all of those positions?
I think starting early is pretty important. I got my first internship at the end of my second year, which was about 6 months after I switched from electrical to software engineering. I think starting early really just means being able to do more the further you get into your uni degree/career. I think there's definitely an element of luck in getting your first job because with no experience it can be quite difficult. But after that, it's really having experience and knowing where you want to go and being able to actively practice things that will get you where you want to be. I think that's just the easiest way to explain it. If you had specific companies, I could give better examples, but yeah, just starting early helps a lot.
Yeah, I feel like I definitely agree with that. And also applying for everything, I feel like also really helps with that luck factor.
Yeah, definitely applying for a lot of companies and just trying to get your foot in the door anywhere helps a lot. A lot of people will knock underpaid internships and stuff, and I will as well. But I will admit that having your first job just helps so much more than you can imagine in getting your second.
Yeah. I suppose more about the specifics of the interview process. I know a lot of people focus on the technical side of it, but obviously most companies do also have that a non-technical side to the application, whether it be even just writing a cover letter and a resume or an actual interview that's about your more personal skills. Do you have any tips for, well, not just practicing leak code for the technical side of things?
Well, if you're going non-technical, it's a little bit harder to give tips. If you're applying to any of the bigger companies that do behavioral sort of interviews, like Atlassian or Amazon, or I think Google does a Googliness interview, then there's a lot of tips you can find online, and it's definitely worth looking at those sort of tips. Most people recommend things like the STAR technique, which if you're unsure, you can Google it, but it's basically just drawing on your own experiences and sort of reviewing your experiences and how they can relate to your behaviors so that you know how to answer the questions if they come up. A lot of people go into interviews with behavioral interviews thinking that it's just like you answer it as you come up, but really being able to draw on your experience is what they're looking for, because unfortunately, just being like, yeah, I'm really good at this is not very reliable. They really want to see how you did something and when it was and what the situation was, so you can talk more about it, because I'm sure they'll ask you to elaborate.
Yeah, okay. Do you think that it's worth kind of pre-preparing scenarios for example questions? Or like
yeah, definitely
examples?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have sort of set questions that people will ask, and like even the silly ones that you sort of don't think about, which is like, oh, how did you show leadership? How did you do like conflict resolution? They are like really common and they definitely come up. I think in my first job interview, I had that, in like my second job interview and like third job interview, and just a lot, especially for uni students, because of the fact it's quite hard for them to draw on experiences from work. They try to ask questions that sort of can be reflected in a uni setting as well for some companies. I definitely think it's worth pre-preparing scenarios or thinking about examples of sort of what you've done and how they relate to that behavioral question, because it will really help you if they ask you something and you can immediately be like, yes, this is a time I did this and this is how I stepped through it. This was sort of where I went with it. And it really comes off a lot better than having to like stop and think about it and then maybe come up with something or maybe not, because it just shows as well that you've prepared and that you're confident in what you've done. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So how do you think you know if a company is going to be a good fit for you?
So I think for me, it's less about company and more about finding the job you want. And at least in my experience within software, the main thing that's going to impact your happiness working somewhere is the work you do day to day and probably the people you end up working with. So the people you end up working with and the team you're in is going to vary massively from company to company and even teams within the same company. So it's very hard to judge experiences based off what someone else says. I've had many different experiences at companies to others, and you'll hear many different things from different companies, whether it's people feeling discriminated against or anything like that, or some people feeling really welcome. But I think it's important, the most thing, and to prevent having this like, oh, I don't know what to do, really starts early on with finding what work you like doing. And finding what work you like doing and preparing for that will mean hopefully if you have offers you're throwing up against or not sure what you want to do, then you'd be happy with any of them. And it's just a matter of picking them. I think trying to pick a job based on a company will not work well most of the time. And if you really don't know, then I would probably try to just look at the process that you've been through, whether you thought the interviews were fair to you, whether they evaluated you, if they treated you with respect through the process, because that'll probably end up reflecting a little bit on the company and how they represent themselves. I think you'll find that companies often treat external applicants better than it ends up being internally, because that's how they represent themselves. So if you've had a bad experience with hiring, then you're probably going to have a bad experience at the company. It's also tricky because in reality, there's a big separation between what happens internally and externally at a lot of companies. But truly, like, people are hired to make you feel good and want to work there. So the company as a whole will probably be reflected by that. But yeah, so we can talk also about, because I find it hard to give advice on like company specifics, but I can give better advice on job specifics, I think.
Okay. But just on the base of how different companies, I suppose, and like the work that you do at each company, I guess I'd like to talk a bit about Google, because Google's kind of an interesting company in that this is from my experience of talking to other people about working at Google, in that the work that you do isn't necessarily the most exciting content, but it's about like the team and the other experiences that's kind of around it that goes towards that. Would you kind of find a similar thing to be true?
So are you saying, just to let me clarify, that even if the work isn't as exciting, there can be things at the company with the people you work with that make the job enjoyable?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely true. I think to some extent, at least, the people you work with are going to be really important. And there can be things at the company that make it really nice to work there. But it is something that's like, at the end of the day, the work you do is going to be work you do for X amount of years. And you really should try to make sure it's something you enjoy, because it's tricky working somewhere where you don't actively enjoy the work. I personally find it really draining mentally to do work that I don't enjoy. So it'll come to the end of the week if I'm working full time and I'll just feel exhausted and not want to do anything over the weekend. And when I've worked places where I've genuinely enjoyed the work where I do, I'll come home and I'll just be energetic and feel fine because it hasn't been draining me all day doing something I don't enjoy. So while I definitely think it's true that you'll have a much better experience at like Google doing work you don't enjoy than maybe some small place doing work you don't enjoy with people you don't like. That doesn't mean that's specifically something you should aim for, because I know lots of people who work for really impressive companies doing work they don't like. And it doesn't make you happy just because you work for a prestigious company or have great people you work with. I think the work is really important. And I should preface that by saying that is my own opinion. Lots of people will probably disagree, but that's what I think.
Yeah. What are some common mistakes you often see people make when picking a job or applying for jobs?
I think I'm privileged in the sense that I started early, so I get to not be worried about whether I find a job or not. And so a lot of my advice ends up being on finding the job you want and mistakes in that sense. But that being said, I think people blindly aim for any job and try to really push for a job straight after graduation rather than taking the time to see where they really want to go with it or what work they would actually enjoy doing. So as an example, I think in engineering, I'm doing software engineering, but also in other degrees, people really push to have a job straight out of graduation. They apply to all these grad jobs and they just try to get any. It's really common. Lots of people are like, yeah, look, I'm just looking for any job. And my opinion is that if you can, maybe take a little time to just figure out what work you want to do. And it's very hard if you're at the end and you're at graduation and you haven't found out what you want to do. And at that point, you can only sort of try to wait and hope that you get placed somewhere or try to do some work yourself and figure out what you like. I think most of my advice will start around trying a lot of different things at uni, trying to work with different languages, with different platforms, front end, back end, and just trying to find one thing you like. And you can probably stick with that for most of the way through. So the common mistake I would think is aiming blindly or aiming just for prestige. In the case of prestige with companies like any big companies in Australia, Amazon, Atlassian, Google, overseas, Facebook, etc., a lot of people, in my opinion, just want to work at the company and get paid well. They don't care so much about the work they do. And it's tricky for me to understand that because as someone who's been working for the last few years and has experienced jobs where I genuinely don't like to work at all, I think that's a mistake. And I think people are happy to sacrifice things now for a prestigious job, but everything's going to end up normalizing and you're going to be at a job you potentially don't like. I would really, really advocate for finding work you like and really just pursue that. I mean, it's really easy to say for people who don't maybe have a lot of options and just want to find a job. But I think there's a really, really big mindset of university students and in computer science of like prestige, find a great job. And it's less about really you should be enjoying the work you do. So I guess that's a bit of a ramble, but what I would consider a mistake when looking for a good job.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I'm definitely of the same mindset in that the amount of time that you spend at work, you really should be doing something that you're at least enjoying somewhat, because otherwise you're spending so much time at work and you're not really getting much reward out of it, except for obviously the monetary benefit.
Yeah, for sure. I actually have a good example now that I think about it. The place I'm currently working, we've recently switched with what we're doing. And what we were doing before, for me, was a lot of sort of like maintenance work and fixing up things, and I wasn't really enjoying it. And now with what we've changed to, even though I work with absolutely lovely people, I wasn't doing work I was enjoying and I wasn't looking forward to going to work. But we've recently started doing work that I genuinely am enjoying. And it's something where I have in the past and am now excited to go to work. It's like I'm genuinely excited to do work I enjoy. And I know I am someone who is like, lots of people will be like, oh, programming or anything like that isn't really like a hobby. It's not a passion. It's something. It's a means to an end. It's a means to work. And that's completely fair. I think that's totally fine. For me, it is a passion. So I am excited to go to work. And I think that's great. I think that's just one example. But the other thing being, even if it's not your passion, there's going to be work you enjoy more than work you don't enjoy. Always. There's always going to be things you prefer. So aim for that.
Yeah, okay. I guess in terms of the types of companies that you might work at instead of prestigious companies, I guess it's always a little bit harder with those, or like companies that are less big in tech or are just smaller tech companies, in that you don't know as much what you're getting into because you haven't heard the 50 million stories of people who have gone there, or the all of their own advertising and campaigns and all of that kind of stuff. I guess, do you have a little bit of insight into working at the big prestigious companies versus less completely tech-oriented companies, or just smaller tech companies?
I have experience at sort of a mid-sized tech company being Atlassian, a massive one being Google. And then there's a really bit of a smaller one that's called CSG, and one that's like medium-sized, bigger than Atlassian but smaller than Google, called SAP, which is very business focused. So they build enterprise stuff. And I'm currently working at a company that is 3 developers. So I feel like I have a pretty wide range of experience with companies there. And I would say the biggest difference for me is the bigger the company that I worked at, or the more tech oriented it was, the more there was a focus on strictly making the tech really good and bringing it to the front. It's like, we have money, we have resources, let's make sure this is done really well. I think in my experience, the non sort of tech oriented companies and some of the smaller companies, and when I say smaller, I don't mean small like a unicorn that's like smaller than Atlassian, smaller than Google, but still very big. I mean companies that are like hundreds of people, in terms of like the lower hundreds. But yeah, so I would say there's mostly that when you work at companies that are smaller or not as, or more business orientated or something else orientated, there's less of a focus on it and it's more of a supplement. So it means working there is less about pushing to get things out. So it's probably a bit more relaxed, but it was also probably a little bit less rewarding if you really want to work on good tech and work on good things and you're passionate about what you build. I think that when it's used as a supplement, it's not checked on, it's not pushed to be the best it can be. And it's maybe more about like, do we want to save the money by cutting corners? Because that's something I've encountered at my current company. It's really important to change priorities when you don't have infinite money, like a lot of big tech companies do. So I would say it's, if you really want to work on like really high quality stuff, then tech companies are the place to be. And that's where a lot of people end up. And there are lots of massive tech companies that people work on. And if you want to have something that is a bit more relaxed, I would say go the other route. At big tech companies, people really care about making stuff really good. I do as well. So it's a bit of a change of pace when I came to a smaller company and their priorities were different. And I think working at a relaxed company is a great thing to do. And when I say relaxed, it's tricky because, for example, at Google, people work pretty normal hours. There's a big misconception that people tend to work really long hours. And that's not necessarily true. But in work hours, I would say it's very go, go, go. It's not super relaxed. It's all about getting work done. And at other companies I've worked at, that's definitely not the case. You might have 8 hours where you're not doing much and no one really cares. So I just think about that. And I think it's really good to have experience so you can understand that for yourself and what sort of environment you like.
Yeah, that really makes sense. I feel like from my experience of working with smaller companies versus larger companies, I tend to find with smaller companies, your contribution is a little bit more substantial because it is a smaller company and you're one of fewer developers. You end up kind of doing a little bit more at a lower quality generally because it's like for the same time you do a little bit more at lower quality rather than like smaller features but at a much more much higher standard.
Yeah, definitely sort of a different experience with what you work on and how spread it is. What I'm doing now is a lot more spread than what I did at Google. That's a whole different thing. The bigger the company you work on, the more focused your work is going to be most of the time, not all of the time. For example, at Google, I was working on something new. I can't talk about it, but it was something that a lot of people, there's this other misconception that it's like a cog in an organization, and I don't really agree with that. It's true in the sense of like you're one of however many thousands of developers and what you work on isn't maybe like fully core to where the money is made. But that doesn't mean you aren't having big impact in the team you work in, which for me, as I haven't reiterated it enough, that my work is important to me. And being able to impact my work is something I care about more than impacting my company's goals. But yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we wrap up?
It's important to not put too much pressure on yourself. And it's important to not compare yourself to others. People are all going to be doing things at a different rate around you. And it's really not a race, even though a lot of computer science students try to like optimize their lives. I find to be a pretty common thing. It's like, this is when I do this is when I do that, this is when I do that. I would say just try to find something you like doing. the earlier you can sort of give it a go, it's probably going to be more beneficial just because it's harder to change jobs after graduation. That's only the real reason it's good to start early in uni. But yeah, just it's good to not worry about it and sort of just take a step back and relax. It'll be fine. Just try different things. That's always my advice.
Okay. That's very good advice, I think. Yeah, thank you for joining me for this first episode of the podcast.